Welcome to BIA Media, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the black community in Ottawa has to offer, and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
All right, everyone. Good morning and welcome to our session. This is the 5th time that we are running this course. This course was first run in the summer of 2019. So this is the 5th time we're running this course. And this is the course, Early History of the African Renaissance, 1896 to the present. It is an 8-week course. It is the final course in our cycle. You know, we started this cycle last July with What History Left Out Part 1, African History from 10,000 BCE to 711. And we've gone all the way through African history up until this point, up until 1896. And this course takes us from 1896 to the present. This is the course where we really look at the modern era and how we've gotten to where we've got. We're going to do it a little bit different this time around, different than what we did last time. And I'll get into that in a second. So as always, again, this is a program that is coming through Jaku Combat, the community organization here in Ottawa that serves the African, Black, and Caribbean community, in conjunction with BIA Media, the Black-owned media group here in Ottawa, Media Central here in Ottawa, right here at 235 Montreal Road. You can come for any podcasting needs, videography, photography, anything that you can think of, you can do here at BIA Media. So this is what is providing the streaming of this. So we are grateful for that partnership. And as always, I'll remind everyone, we are in person. In person here, I have a couple of students from high school students that are working on a very important project, the Africa in Ottawa project, that you will hear more about in the upcoming weeks. So you're always free to come here every Saturday at 11 a.m., 235 Montreal Road to come join us here in the studio, or you can continue to join us from Zoom or YouTube or however it is that you're watching. So, next slide, please. This week, week 1, we're going to do a couple of things. The first thing we're going to talk about is what exactly we're studying in this class and why focus on Africana literature. Those of you that registered online, you saw in the description that we're doing things a little bit different this go-around. In 2022, when we ran this course, the focus was on particular meetings of the African world. We talked about the Pan-African conferences. We talked about all these historic meetings that occurred both in Africa and around the African world. This year's focus is going to be on literature, books, films, poetry. These works, both fiction and nonfiction, that were created by Africans throughout the world, and how it influenced the time period that we're talking about, 1896 to the present. The first work that we're going to consider today, and all of these works are widely available. I'm not presenting you with anything that you can't find either on Amazon or completely free online. In fact, the next book that we'll read for our class that we'll have in 2 weeks, I put the entire book on our course website. For those of you that are familiar with how these courses run, we have these lectures every Saturday, but you also have access to the course website, which was in your registration email. That website includes previous recordings of past lectures for the past 5 years. It also includes resources, books, journal articles, book chapters, videos that all talk about the time period that we're discussing and various personalities and events and all of that. So that's available completely free. All of this is completely free to all of you. But the books will be there, at least, or links to them. If I can't put the entire book up, the links to the books will be there. That way you can read the books for yourself. You can follow along, and then when we get to our question and answer period, we have 2, one in the middle of the lecture and one at the end of the lecture. You can bring in your own thoughts about the materials. Remember, I'm just a facilitator of this course. I don't know everything, and I don't pretend to know everything. My task is just to present this information. You all have your own minds, your own thoughts, your own research, and we have conversation during those times. So keep that in mind as well. We're going to talk about today the after effects of the Ethiopian victory at the Battle of Ottawa in 1896. That's where we stopped our last full course. We're going to talk about the after effects of that for the African world, and we're going to talk about the African response to colonization at the turn of the 20th century, when it goes from the 1800s to the 1900s. Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, was under colonization. Africans in the Caribbean were under colonization. Africans in Canada, in the U.S., and other places in the world were dealing with anti-African, anti-black racism in its most extreme forms of Jim Crow racism and segregation and all of that. So we're going to talk about how Africans responded to those things. Most importantly today, we're going to talk about the connections throughout the African world, because none of these things happen in isolation. We're going to talk about Africans from Haiti that were connected to Africans from the U.S., who were connected to Africans from Ethiopia, who were connected to Africans from Congo and South Africa, and how our struggles have always been intertwined. And that's an important part of this class. We're going to talk about that. And the book that we're going to focus on today is a book by a Haitian brother. And everybody, please forgive me, because I don't speak French. So I grew up in the States, and they told us in the States when I was coming up, learn Spanish. You need to learn Spanish. So I learned Spanish. I had no idea I was going to end up in Ottawa. So I can't speak French. So I'm going to butcher this. But the book that we're going to read is done by the Haitian activist, Pan-Africanist, internationalist, someone I'll introduce you to today, Benito Silva, and it's his Étude historique sur les sortes des indigenous dans les colonies d'exploitation. This is, and I got a thumbs up from Brother PJ, who's running the cameras and said I did all right. This book in English is the historical study of the fate of natives in colonies of exploitation. It's one of the most important texts written about colonization from the perspective of African people. So this is a Haitian brother that ends up in Africa, serving in Ethiopia, but then he makes it his life's mission to connect Africans all over the world at the height of European colonization. So we're going to talk about this book and what it means for this time period. All the books and the literature that we talk about, I'm not saying that they're the most important things that were written during this time period, but they are pieces that help us explain what was going on, how Africans thought about the world, and how it connects to other events and personalities during the time. Next slide. Course objectives. So at the end of this course, at the end of the 8 weeks, you all will be able to do this. If you follow along with the lectures, if you go and utilize the course website, you'll be able to do these things by the time we get done with the 8 weeks. That's my task as a teacher, as a facilitator, is to get you to the point that you can do these things. Identify key events and personalities that have influenced the African Renaissance, the time period that we're in, the rebirth of Africa, following colonization, neocolonialism, imperialism, so on and so forth. You'll be able to assess the strategies and tactics used by African peoples for liberation and self-determination. What did we do to get free? What worked? What didn't work? What's working now? What's not working now? We'll be able to assess those things. We'll be able to discuss the hindrances, both internal and external, to human development of African people. What is causing us to either escape poverty or stay in poverty? What's causing us not to be able to deal with the environmental changes that are occurring on the continent? What's causing the conflicts between people, like what's going on in Sudan? What are the internal and external factors that's creating all of that? And lastly, you'll be able to analyze the connections and struggles between Africans at home and abroad. This is a key element of this course. We are talking about the connections, like I mentioned earlier. There are so many connections between the struggles of different African peoples that we can't fight all these issues that we're talking about, and we can't create the African Renaissance as individuals or even as groups. We have to work together as African people, whether you're on the continent, whether you're in East Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, whether you're in the Caribbean, whether you're in North America, whether you're in Europe. We all have to work together to make this a reality. And this history will show a number of examples where this was the case. Because it's often taught that African people, they can't work together. Or Caribbeans don't like folks from the continent. Folks from the continent don't rock with people from North America. But that's not true. And this class is going to show you why this connection and struggle is key. Next slide, please. All right. As always with our 8-week courses, we have to start with a pretest. As a teacher, I know the importance of these things. We have to assess what you know now, and then at the end of the 8 weeks, we'll do a post-test to see what you learned. So I want everyone to get a piece of paper and write down how many of these you get right and how many of these you get wrong. And keep that number recorded with you, because we're going to do the same, not the same test, but a similar test at the end. And we want to make sure that your score increases if you pay attention to the lectures, if you take notes, if you use our course website. So let's start with number 1. Who was the Trinidadian lawyer who called for the first Pan-African Conference in 1900? Very important meeting of African people that happened in the year 1900, right in the height of colonization. Was it A, George Padmore, B, W.E.B. Du Bois, C, Henry Sylvester Williams, D, C.L.R. James, or is it E, none of the above? And if you think it's E, none of the above, and you can write the name of the person who it was, you get a point extra credit. So take a couple of seconds. Do you think it's A, B, C, D, or E? And I'm going to do something, and you all won't be able to see this, but we have some folks in the audience. Somebody give me a guess. And say it loud so that the mic can pick you up. You think it's A, B, C, or D, or E? Any guess? C? Henry Sylvester Williams. Was that?
I'll go with D.
D?
I say D.
D?
D.
Okay.
Yeah.
The correct answer actually is C. Was that just a complete guess?
I'm just thinking of eliminating the difference.
Okay, yes, it was C, Henry Sylvester Williams. We're going to talk about Henry Sylvester Williams today. So if you chose C, you were correct. So mark down what you got right, or if you got it wrong. Next one, please. Which countries contributed to the chaos in the Democratic Republic of the Congo during the 20th century? So we're looking for the name of the country that helped sow the chaos in the Congo. Are we talking about the U.S., Canada, France, Belgium, all of the above, or was it some country that's not mentioned here? Was it none of the above? Which country was responsible for the chaos in the Congo? Who has a guess? Yep.
Belgium.
F, none of the above? I heard Belgium from the audience. Anybody other guesses?
All of the above.
All of the above, Belgium. If you answered E, all of the above, you are correct. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the Congo. All of these countries played a role in the underdevelopment of the richest place on earth. The Democratic Republic of Congo is the richest country on earth in terms of its mineral wealth and its potential. Yet all of these countries, United States, Canada, France, Belgium, have attempted, and successfully up to this point, have created a situation where the wealth of the Congo is not going to the Congolese people. We're going to talk about that. And they all played a role in the assassination of Congo's first leader, Patrice Lumumba. We'll talk about that. Next slide, please. The Algerian Revolution. So we're talking about North Africa now. A lot of folks, when they talk about African history, they pretend as though Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Morocco are now a part of Africa, or Tunisia, they're not part of Africa, that they're somehow Arab countries. They're not. People speak Arabic, there's Arabs there, but this is Africa. So the Algerian Revolution can best be described as a struggle against what? Settler colonialism, indirect rule, apartheid, German aggression, or none of the above. What do folks think about the Algerian Revolution? Any guesses? Guesses?
Settler colonialism.
A? I heard settler colonialism. Others? Anybody? Others? C? Apartheid? Okay. The correct answer is A. Very good. It is A, settler colonialism. We will talk about the different types of colonialism. And this one in particular, whenever there's a settler colony in places like Algeria, in places like Kenya, in places like Zimbabwe, the fight to end that colonialism was a lot more brutal because the Europeans that came to these countries, they wanted to stay. And that's a whole different dynamic. So you really got to fight to get those folks out. So we'll talk about the Algerian Revolution and its impacts on the rest of Africa. Okay, next question. Martinican, so this brother's from Martinique, René Maron, wrote the book Blank, which became an inspiration for both Anglophone and Francophone African writers. It's one of the most important fiction books in African history. This is the one that we will be reading over the next 2 weeks. So we won't meet next week because I have to go to a graduation. My younger brother is graduating from college. I'm incredibly proud of him. So I have to go back to the States, but then I'll be back. So in that time period, I want everyone, well, I can't give you the answer yet. What is the name of the book that Renee Moran wrote? Is it A, Cry of Freedom, B, The New Negro, C, Weary Blues, B, Batuala, or E, Wretched of the Earth? Which one of these books? Yeah. D? B? Other guesses? What's that?
Wretched of the Earth.
Wretched of the Earth? What'd you say? Cry of Freedom? Yeah. C, Weary Blues. Good guesses, but if you answered D, who said D? D, one of the youngest people in the room answered D, and he was correct. Batuala. We will read this book over the next 2 weeks. I put the link to it on our course website. You can get it off of Amazon. You can get it in either English or French. It's one of the most important fiction books. And although it is fiction, it deals with colonialism from the perspective of a black man from the Caribbean who was in Central Africa at the time working for the French, but was able to see the effects of colonization in Africa and wrote this from the perspective of an African chief. Very good book that influenced a number of African writers, both on the continent, in the Caribbean, and in the United States and Canada. So we're going to talk about that book in 2 weeks. Next slide, please. Which of the following were tactics of the Igbo Women's War of 1929? This was a battle against British colonialism in Nigeria, instituted by African women. Was it A, looting factories, B, burning down native court buildings, C, blocking train tracks, D, releasing prisoners from colonial jails, E, all of the above, or F, none of the above? Did they do none of these things? What do we think about the Igbo Women's War? Yeah. All of the above? Yeah. None of the above? All of the above? Other guesses?
All of the above.
All of the above. These sisters did all of the above. They were fighting against taxation in Nigeria, and they looted factories, they burnt down native court buildings, they blocked train tracks, they released prisoners from colonial jail, and they did a couple of other things that we will talk about in their struggle against British colonialism. Next slide. Black consciousness, this idea of black consciousness movements occurred in which of the following countries in the 20th century? Trinidad, the US, South Africa, Brazil, all of the above, or none of the above? Where do we have these black consciousness movements? Yeah. None of the above? Folks?
All of the above.
All of the above? Any other guesses? C? What is C? South Africa? Okay. If you answered E, all of the above, you are correct. We have black consciousness movements in all of these countries. This is a movement in the mid-20th century where folks are moving from this concept of the Negro and this concept of being colonized to embracing blackness. And it's a qualitative change. This is something that I know if my brother David H. is on, we're going to have a lot of discussion about this. But this is a very important political movement in the mid-20th century, part of the leading to the African Renaissance. And this might be the last one. Let me see. Is there any more? Okay. True or false? The battle against apartheid in South Africa was largely a non-violent struggle. What do we think about that? The battle against apartheid. False? Any? False. False? Anybody for true? Okay, this might be an easy one. Yes, it was false. The Africans in South Africa, we're going to talk about the struggle, how the ANC, the reason Nelson Mandela was incarcerated for 27 years is because they were engaged in some struggle, some violent struggle, and it continued. And even the neighboring countries in South Africa were going to use warfare in Angola, in Namibia, and other places, Zimbabwe, to fight against the apartheid in South Africa. So we're going to talk about that whole process. And last one, is this the last one? Yes, this is the last one. Which of the following leaders called for a United States of Africa? Was it Kwame Nkrumah? Was it Muammar Gaddafi? Was it Sekou Touré? Was it Abdoulaye Wade, or all of the above? Which of these African leaders was calling for a United States of Africa? You know. D, Wade? Other folks?
I think it's all of the above.
All of the above. I heard a B for Muammar Gaddafi. Any other guesses?
I think it's Kwame Nkrumah.
Kwame Nkrumah. Hey, all of the above. At some point or another, all of these leaders were arguing for a United States of Africa, a more unified Africa. You take all 54, 55 countries in Africa, and it would create a superpower, according to these African leaders. A number of them were overthrown primarily for having this vision and trying to make it a reality. We're going to talk about that. Particularly, we'll talk about the Gaddafi case, because that's one of the more recent events in African history that we have to assess when we talk about where the African Renaissance is today. I think that might be the last one. That's the last one. So mark down your score. Did you get 5 out of 8, 6 out of 8? Maybe you only got 1 out of 8. That's okay. It doesn't matter what you get coming in. What matters is what you get coming out. Because if you still have 1 out of 8 after this course, that means I haven't done my job. So write down your score, keep a record of it, and then we'll come back to this at the end of the 8-week course. All right, so jumping right into it. We're talking about the African Renaissance. This was a term given to this period by a number of different scholars. The earliest example, one of the earliest examples, is the Senegalese scholar Cheikh Anta Diop, who wrote a text about an African Renaissance. Renaissance, or when a people, is usually associated with the Europeans, the European Renaissance, is when Europe rediscovered itself. Europe went back into its own philosophy and art and all these things and helped Europe develop in the 15th and 16th century. The African Renaissance is African thinkers and leaders saying, how do we increase the human development in Africa? How do we use African culture, African political systems, African economic ideas to really increase the lives of African people? How do we practice Sankofa? How do we do these things? And this was built in Senegal as a monument to the African Renaissance. It's a huge statue, but it also represents the problems with a lot of the leaders articulating African Renaissance, or a lot of the leadership and political decisions that are made in Africa. Because while this is a great symbol, and this is huge, you see, these are people here. This is how big the statue is. It's almost like a mountain in Senegal. If you go to Senegal, you will see this sculpture to the African Renaissance. The problem is, it's a symbol, it's a great symbol, but could the resources that were used to create this have gone to a better purpose? Hospitals, agricultural development, educational initiatives. So the question is, how do we move from symbol to actual substance? 21st century when it comes to the African Renaissance. We want the African Renaissance to be of substance. We want African people to be healthy. We want African people to be prosperous. We want African people to have a sense of, technical issue, to have a sense of culture and Sankofa and history. So how do we move in that direction? That's the question that we're going to ask. So although we love the symbol, symbol is not enough. Symbol is not nearly enough for what we're trying to create and achieve. Next slide, please. All right, so where we left off, the last major course that we left off with the Ethiopian victory at the Battle of Adwa, one of the most important events in African world history. In 1896, the Ethiopians defeat the Italians who were trying to colonize the country. When this happens, the African world is ecstatic. This was the time that Ethiopia became, for Africans then, what the fictionalized country of Wakanda is for African people today. It was a sense of hope and pride. And now Wakanda's not real. You know, black people flock to go see the Black Panther movies. They 1, 2, whenever they come out, Wakanda Forever, all that stuff. It's not a real place. Ethiopia was real. This is a real African kingdom that existed with a king, an emperor, and a queen. And for black people around the world, they beat white folks. They beat the Italians in a war, a modern war in 1896. So it became the symbol of hope for black folks. There were 2 symbols at this time. 1896, the Ethiopians defeated the Italians. Earlier in the century, in 1804, the Haitians defeated the French to maintain and gain their independence. So you have these two spaces of liberation, symbols of liberation for black people. Haiti in the west, Ethiopia in the east in Africa. Next slide, please. This Ethiopian victory would unleash a wave of sentiment and an ideology across the African world called Ethiopianism. And we talked about this a number of times in this class. But it's the idea of race redemption that black theologians and theorists in different parts of the English colonized world derive from biblical Ethiopia. This is Scott's definition. In the Bible, there's a passage. It's called Psalms 68:31. Princes shall come forth out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hands unto God. African people all over the world read this passage in the Bible. They saw what happened in actual Ethiopia where they defeated the Italians and saved themselves from colonization. And they said, this place must be special. We need to connect with Ethiopia. They represent all of black people, the entire race Ethiopia represents. And we need to defend Ethiopia, and we need to, love Ethiopia. That was the sentiment. And they traced it back to this Bible. They said, this place must be blessed because it's mentioned in the Bible. They don't mention Britain in the Bible. They don't mention France in the Bible. They don't mention Germany in the Bible, or Belgium in the Bible, or the United States is not mentioned in the Bible. The few countries that are mentioned in the Bible outside of Palestine and Egypt, Ethiopia is there. So if Ethiopia is in the Bible, this place that's clearly in Africa, clearly ruled by this black king and this black queen, if that place is special enough to be mentioned in the Bible, stretching forth its hands unto God, then that means we are special as a people, as an African people. And this situation that we're in, whether we're colonized in the Caribbean, whether we're colonized in Africa, whether we are facing Jim Crow segregation in North America, in Canada, and the U.S., we're special. And we're special because we're connected to this place as a race, Ethiopia. Next slide, please. Again, when the news of the victory of Ethiopia made it to Africans all over the world, they wrote about it. They wrote about it in the black newspapers in Cleveland. They wrote about it in Brazil. They wrote about it, next slide, in places all over the world. This is a newspaper from Brazil called O Menelik. Menelik was the name of the emperor of Ethiopia at the time. So this is going worldwide. This is, again, before the internet. This is before the fax machine. This is before any of this. The news spread so rapidly because Africans were so proud of this victory. Next slide. And we can now see the political map of Africa. Everywhere else on the continent was colonized, meaning it was under the control of one European power or the other. Either the British, the French, the Belgians, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Germans, etc. This map will show you that Liberia was independent. Liberia was not independent. Liberia was a settler colony of the United States, and we've talked about that in previous classes. So the only place that's independent is the Empire of Ethiopia. Now, this is not to say that Ethiopia was a paradise, that Ethiopia was, devoid of exploitation. It was not. There was a whole lot of class exploitation going on in Ethiopia. But to the outsiders who didn't see any of this, they thought Ethiopia was paradise, and that this Emperor Menelik was benevolent, and that his queen, Empress Taitu, was this great African warrior queen. So they didn't see any of the negative aspects of Ethiopia. But if we're going to assess history correctly, which we will do in this class, we have to know what's going on inside of Ethiopia. A lot of class exploitation, a lot of exploitation of the working people, the peasantry in Ethiopia, a lot of division that was created as this empire was expanding. So there's people in this territory that aren't happy with the emperor. And that's going to explode later on in the 20th century. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so next slide, please. In our previous course, we talked about the Berlin Conference, where the European powers got together to establish the rules of colonization in Africa that would play out in that division of Africa that we see. Next slide, please. One more. And this is Menelik. This is the emperor of Ethiopia. This was the symbol of the race at this time. Black people in Jamaica, in Haiti, in the U.S., in Canada, they knew this name of Emperor Menelik II. Menelik II claimed descent from King Solomon again, another biblical figure, and the Queen of Sheba. This is the Solomonic dynasty. So for so many black people, they can point to, yeah, they beat the Italians. The emperor is descended from King Solomon. This is ordained. We need to be connected with these people, so on and so forth. Next slide. So this affected, again, Africans, not just on the continent, but throughout the diaspora. Those Africans that were spread to places like Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America as a result of the European-initiated slave trade. So just going, again, this is all recapping what we talked about in the previous course. Next slide. We're going to start today with Haiti. We're going to start today with Haiti because we're going to have the figure that we're going to talk about today, Benito Sylvan, who comes out of Haiti and then goes to Ethiopia because he is living in the only other independent, liberated African space in the world. You got Haiti, you got Ethiopia. So when news of this victory reaches Haiti, the Haitians say, we want to have a connection with Ethiopia. We are both these symbols of liberation. How do we connect? Next slide. Enter, and one more. Enter this man, Benito Sylvan. Benito Sylvan, not much is known, at least in English sources. I have to look more into the French and Haitian sources, but in the English sources, not so much is known about his early life, but we know he's educated in Haiti and also educated in Paris. And he's at Paris at the time where a number of Haitian intellectuals are in Paris in the 1880s, 1890s. And they are fighting against French scientific racism and French academic racism. So you got these Haitians that are incredibly intelligent, studying in France, and you're coming up against these Europeans that are saying, at the time, black people are inferior. Black people are completely incapable scientifically, genetically, from being equal to whites. And they're writing all this in these French journals, and he's there at the time fighting against this. So he's going back and forth between Haiti and Paris. He becomes a Haitian diplomat, and he is sent to Ethiopia in the 1890s. And when he goes to Ethiopia representing Haiti, the emperor meets with him. And he's, according to Sylvan's writings, the Emperor Menelik is so happy to have this connection that he makes him his aide-de-camp. Aide-de-camp. It's a military official that's almost like a military secretary. So according to Sylvan, and we don't know how true this is or what exact the relationship between him and the Emperor of Ethiopia, but according to Sylvan, he was the emperor's personal secretary. And when I say according to Sylvan, I'm only saying that because we only have his side of it. We don't have any Ethiopian documents that say this, at least not that I'm aware of. But it wouldn't be surprising if it was the case, because we do know at the time that Menelik II's personal physician was a brother from, was he from Trinidad? I think he might have been from Trinidad. I got to double check. Either Trinidad or Guadeloupe was his personal physician. So we knew that the Emperor of Ethiopia relied on Africans from the outside to help out and help develop Ethiopia. And that would continue with Haile Selassie. We'll get to that later. When he was in Paris, going back and forth between Ethiopia, Paris, and Haiti, he founded the Black Youth Association in Paris. Again, it's a collection of these Africans, particularly from Haiti, that are studying in Paris, that are fighting against this idea of scientific racism, and that are trying to develop black pride. At the same time, he's also organizing and corresponding with another fellow Haitian named Antenor Furman. Next slide, please. Antenor Furman, right at the time of the Berlin Conference, again, Europeans have been saying this since slavery, that white folks are up here, Asian people are down here, other brown people, indigenous people are here, and then black Africans are way down here. That was their position. That black people were genetically inferior. Black people were culturally inferior. Black people would never be equal to white folks. And they were using these pseudo-theories to explain that. They would take black people's skulls, place them next to white people's skulls, and they say, look how the black peoples are closer to monkeys than there are to white people, who were seen as the epitome of the human race. And they were teaching this in school and justifying the imperial projects, justifying colonization, justifying slavery, justifying all these and racial segregation on this idea. So Antenor Furman comes along and he says, no. That's bad science. That's bad anthropology. Everything you're saying is false. And he writes this book called The Equality of the Human Races in 1885. The same year that they were concluding the Berlin Conference to divide up Africa, Furman writes this book. Furman writes in this book that there is no such thing as inequality among human beings. There's just oppression and folks that have lived under oppression, and because of that, their development has been stunted, and freedom. The freedom, if all people are given the same opportunity for freedom, they can advance and they can develop. So Furman writes this book, and he is another Haitian diplomat, Haitian government official, and he's working with Benito Sylvan and the other Haitian youth that are in Paris at the time fighting against these ideas. So very influential book, and someone whose name you should know. Next slide, please. So the book that we're going to consider on the fate of on the natives and colonies of exploitation, he writes this in 1901. It's kind of along the same lines. And in this book, he compares what the Europeans are doing in Africa to what the U.S. is doing in its colonies in the Caribbean. And he compares colonization. And he says, look, we have to look at this as African people to see what's happening to us and how we can fight against it. So he publishes his book in 1901, all while he's having these conversations. Next slide. And again, this is the book. And the book has been placed on our course website if you want to read it. It's only available in French. I've not found an English translation of this. So when I engage with this book, I have to read the book in French, then I have to have Google Translate open, and I have to go paragraph by paragraph translate it, because there's no English edition for this book. Next slide. But he talks about a couple of things. He breaks down the colonizers in three different categories. One are the conscious enslavers. He calls them vampires, more or less, disguised as men. He says when we look at the situation of what's going on in Africa today, the Europeans are there, they're conscious enslavers. They're consciously exploiting African people. And he provides a number of examples in the book. I'm going to talk about a few of them. Now, one of them he talks about in the book, and the other one he doesn't talk about. But both of them are examples of what was going on in the late 1800s and the early 1900s to African people. Next slide. We're going to start with the most vicious example. The most vicious example, which is that of the Congo when it was controlled by Belgium. So we're talking about Congo-Kinshasa, the Democratic Republic of Congo. This huge area in Africa, one of the richest places on earth. The Belgians had originally come into the Congo looking for ivory. They wanted to exploit the ivory trade. So, elephants, rhinoceros, all of that. Particularly elephants, though, because the European economy relied on ivory to make different things. And they even shipped the ivory to Asia and to America for piano keys and chess pieces and all this. This is when the elephants start to become endangered. When the Africans were in control of the region, elephants weren't endangered. We had a relationship with the natural world. There weren't endangered animals in Africa. We let the animals do their thing. We did our thing. But when the Europeans come, just like what happened with the American bison and other animals, the elephants start being hunted to extinction. But ivory was the first reason that the Belgians came to the Congo. But then they soon found something else. Rubber. Rubber became the fascination of the Europeans in the Congo. Rubber for bicycle tires, car tires, all these things that were being manufactured in Europe. Next slide, please. So when we look at it, what you see in the light green, the neon green, is the country of Belgium. Little tiny Belgium in Europe. Belgium controlled the Congo, which is 70 times larger than Belgium. This is the nonsense of colonization. A little tiny country like Belgium can control this entire space, 70 times its size. Next slide, please. If you want to read about what happened in the Congo, the book that you should read is King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild. This book talks about this infamous man. If you think Hitler is bad. Hitler killed so many people in the Holocaust and in World War II and all of that. King Leopold, for African people, is just as bad, if not worse. This book will tell you about the atrocities that were committed. Next slide. King Leopold was granted control over the Congo at the Berlin Conference. We talked about when the European powers got together. And the Europeans, the French didn't want the British to have the Congo. The British didn't want the French to have the Congo. So they said, well, let's give it to the Belgians. And the Belgians, what King Leopold said he was going to do, he said, oh, there's a slave trade going on in the Congo. I want to end the slave trade, and I want to help the Congolese people get education and get development. This was what he told the world. He said, I'm going to go into the Congo, and I'm going to civilize that place. Because remember, these Europeans are all saying that black people are uncivilized, that we're basically just up from apes. That's how they thought about us. So he said, I'm going to bring Christianity to the Congo. I'm going to build hospitals. I'm going to end the slave trade that's happening in the Congo. All these things that he said he was going to do. But the reality was, he just wanted to exploit Congo for himself. Congo becomes his personal property. So unlike the other European powers, where the state, England controlled Ghana, France controlled Algeria, France controlled Mali in these places. The Belgians didn't control it as a government. Congo was the personal property of this man. He opened it up as a free trade zone. So he allowed all the other European powers to let their companies come in and exploit Congo, tax-free. And exploit Congo they did. Between 1885, at the end of the Berlin Conference, and 1908, so how many years is that, 23 years? Somewhere between 5 to 8 million Congolese were killed. 5 to 8 million Congolese people. So again, put this in perspective. About 6 million people died in the Holocaust that everybody knows about. Everybody knows about the European Holocaust. What happened to the Jewish people and the Roma people and the disabled people and the gay people and the Jehovah's Witnesses and the black people, because there were black people killed in the Holocaust too. All these people that were killed in the Holocaust, everyone knows. Everyone knows what Germany did. It's talked about, never forget. That's the slogan of the Holocaust, never forget. Not many people know about this. And then when people look at Africa today, say, why isn't Africa developing? What's going on with the Congo? How come we get 5 to 8 million Congolese were killed? And this doesn't even include the number of Congolese people that had their hands chopped off because they didn't get enough rubber for the European companies. It doesn't count the number of Congolese women that were raped and then had their children taken from them by the colonizers. It doesn't count the people that had their ears cut off and toes cut off and were branded and were whipped with whips made out of the hide of hippopotamuses and ripped off people's flesh. It doesn't account for all the psychological torture and trauma inflicted on this population. Not just at this time. This is just during Leopold's time. But it got so bad in the Congo that even the other European powers, the other ruthless colonizers were like, hey, you've gone too far. And they said, you have to give control over to the Belgian government. It can't just be yours because you're making all of us look bad. And this is coming from France. This is coming from Britain and coming from Germany. So you know it's bad if they're saying that you've gone too far. Next slide, please. It wasn't initially even white people that brought up what was going on in the Congo, these atrocities. It was two black men, George Washington Williams and William Shepard, because initially, when they heard that Leopold was taking over control of the Congo, they had said, oh, okay, we believe him. Because he said, I'm going to bring Christianity. These men were Christian. They was like, cool, we want to spread the gospel of Christ in the Congo. Let's go. He said, we want to end the slave trade. These men are from the United States. Slavery had just ended in the United States in their generation. So they said, hey, we're going to have the opportunity to fight against slavery in Africa, where our people are from. Let's go. But when they get there, they realize the type of atrocities that are going on, the villages that are being massacred, the forced labor, which is slavery. So the Belgians say we're going to end slavery. What the Belgians actually did was create a new system of slavery in Congo. So when these African Americans went there, they started writing about this. They went and told the entire world that, hey, this needs your attention. We have to fight against this. And they did that. Next slide, please. One of the key fighters in this struggle was Booker T. Washington is more familiar to most audiences as being one of the leading educators among African Americans. He was probably, after Emperor Menelik, the most well-known black person in the world in the 1890s and the early 20th century. He was the Obama of his time. He was one of the first black people invited to the White House. He had control over a number of resources, and he was incredibly influential. So Washington is connected with a number of other Africans that are forming something called the African Association. He's writing to the Trinidadian Henry Sylvester Williams here. And he says, I heard about your African associations trying to bring Africans together. Let me help out. Next slide. He had been involved in something called the Congo Reform Association. And he was bringing the attention to what was going on in the Congo. Next slide. Booker T. Washington gave this speech called Cruelty in the Congo Country. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, you have one of the most prominent African Americans, the most prominent African American of the time, talking about what's going on in Africa. This is an example of these connections that occur, because so many people will tell you, oh, African Americans, they don't know anything or care anything about what's going on in Africa. And Booker T. Washington, and no one talks about this when they talk about this man, because you'll read a lot about Booker T. Washington, you'll never know that he was an advocate for ending colonization or ending the exploitation in the Congo. And he writes, villages today are being burned. People are murdered or maimed. Dr. Shepard, he's talking about the Dr. Shepard, tells me that with his own eyes in one village, he saw 81 human hands which had been severed from the body and were hung up and dried to be presented to the Belgian authorities as evidence that the soldiers had performed their duty. All of this is taking place for what purpose? In order that a few may be enriched at the expense of the many in a far-off country? Civilization should see to it that a change take place. My friends, Europe should set a better example to my people in Africa. And he got an applause for saying this. So this is the type of activism that was occurring across the African world. Next slide. And these are these examples of what Benito Sylvan was talking about when he said conscious enslavers, vampires that are acting as people. This is the example. Another one, Southwest Africa, Namibia. This was controlled by the Germans. Again, this is the brutality of colonization. Next slide. A book that you can read about, The Kaiser's Holocaust, Germany's Forgotten Genocide. Germany had come to Southwest Africa, what's now known as Namibia, and they wanted to establish a settler colony. They were going to take over the land. They were going to bring German people from Germany to live in Southwest Africa. In order to do that, though, they had to fight against and attempt to exterminate the people that were in Southwest Africa, the Herero people and the Nama people, and also the San people. 75% of the Herero people were killed between 1904 and 1908, about 100,000 people. A number of them were put in concentration camps, something that the Germans would use later on in the Holocaust. 20,000 Nama people were killed. A lot of these people were forced into the Kalahari Desert to starve to death and were murdered, all because they wanted to control the land of these folks. So this was going on. Next slide. Images were coming out. We know the images of the Holocaust in Germany, but this is the Holocaust in Africa. People being hung from trees, people being starved to death in concentration camps. All of this was occurring, and African people were fighting against it. Next slide. People like Henrik Witbooi, the captain who disappears in the grass. He's one of the organizers of the resistance among the Herero people against the Germans in Southwest Africa. He is a hero of African resistance. Next slide. And he tried to get all African people to come together to fight against the Europeans. He said, come, brothers, let us together oppose this danger which threatens to invade our Africa. For we are one color and custom, and this Africa is ours. For the fact that we red chiefs occupy our various realms and homelands is but a lesser division of the one Africa. So again, a lot of people think Africans never attempted to come together. Africans never tried to fight against the Europe. They did. You had these African leaders that had this type of vision. And they're fighting on the continent, and they're also connecting with Africans from the Caribbean, from places like Haiti, from Jamaica, from Trinidad, from the US, who were all focused on ending colonization. And again, this is the early 1900s where these Africans are organizing. Next slide. So we're getting close on time. That's because that pre-test took a lot of time, but let me go a little faster. The next group of folks that he talks about in this book are the unconscious enslavers. So the Europeans that aren't as bad as, they're still bad, but they're not as bad as the others. These are the ones, without mistreating the indigenous out of prejudice, intending to keep them perpetually in the condition of social inferiority. Next slide. So he sees it as an example in the Caribbean, where they're not saying that they're going to exterminate all the black people, but they create the conditions that the black people can't develop on their own. Next slide, please. And click it one more time. We're also talking about other places in Africa where the Europeans didn't come to live. Places like Ghana, places like Nigeria, where they came to exploit the resources and, again, put Africa in a place of underdevelopment and dependency. Another example, and an example of resistance to this, next slide, is the Europeans that came to Ghana, that fought against the Ashanti Empire. Next slide. That attempted to take the golden stool and were met with resistance by this woman, Yaa Asantewaa, one of the queen mothers among the Ashanti, who fought against the British as they attempted to take the symbol of power in Ghana, the golden stool. So we have these examples of the Europeans coming in to colonize, whether it was settler colonialism, whether it was company rule as we saw in the Congo, whether it was indirect rule that we see in Ghana. But what Sylvan was pointing out in his book, that it was all designed to stunt the growth of African people and to create a situation where Africa was dependent. And he wanted to fight against that. Next slide, please. Next one, sorry, so that's Yaa Asantewaa. So he had a plan. So he was going to bring Africans together to fight against us. We'll talk about that plan in a second. Let's take our first Q&A. I know we're already at 12. We'll probably go to about 12:15, 12:30 today, just because of what we have to discuss. But we'll stop for our first Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand, or you could put it in the chat. Okay, Daniel is here. Daniel, if you can monitor the chat for me and let me know. And I see Robin's hand. So Robin, go ahead.
Actually, just a comment about what you mentioned about the Holocaust and who was killed in it. I would suspect that if you went to 10 people and asked them who died in the Holocaust, probably, yeah, maybe all 10 would have an idea that somebody else other than Jews died, but in terms of who that is, they not have a very good idea. And they certainly would not know the story of black folks and why they died, right? And which is, right? So after the First World War, when you win a war, you gotta send somebody in there to take control the land you took, right? So they sent in African soldiers to Germany, and things were bad in Germany after they lost the First World War, right? So part of what they sent were African soldiers to control the place, right? So of course, and the German citizens already were not liking life, right? So they had these black guys who were in there soldiers, and then those black soldiers hooked up with German women and had kids who were then German, right? So they were then eligible for like social services and stuff. That was a source of the hatred, right? And of course, always an economic base, right? That then fueled, right? And so that part of that story is not well known at all. Then you went to those 10 people again, none of them would know that.
Yeah, very true. Daniel, anything in the chat?
No, there's nothing in the chat right now.
All right. Any other hands? Any questions that folks have? All right. So we'll keep going because we'll save the rest for our open Q&A at the end. So what was the African response to all of this? Sylvain had got together with a number of the people that we mentioned so far. So again, he's already working with his mentor, one of his mentors, Antonio Furman in Paris. And they had come up with the idea. They said, we need to counter this academic thinking that African people are inferior. So let's bring together all the African intellectuals that we can in Paris, because they're going to have a World's Fair type thing, a Universal Exposition in Paris in 1900. Let's bring them together and let's meet in Paris and let's show the world that we have Africans that can think, that can write, that can do different things. As he was thinking about this with Furman, he also hears that there's a Trinidadian young man who had just arrived in London that's also thinking about putting on a conference. And he hears this actually from Booker T. Washington, because so the Haitian Sylvain, the Haitian who has went to Ethiopia, has become the private secretary to the Emperor of Ethiopia. So again, he goes from Haiti to Ethiopia to Paris. He hears about, from Booker T. Washington, the Afro-American, about what's going on in Congo, and that there's this African association that's been created to bring African people around the world together to fight against this. And he connects with Henry Sylvester Williams. And Sylvester Williams was thinking about his own conference of bringing black people from the British Empire together. But Sylvain convinces him and said, no, don't just have it with black people under British colonialism. Let's bring everybody together for this conference. This is one of the most important meetings in African world history. And he writes about this conference, and he says the conference was astonishing for many, disturbing for some, and of overwhelming importance for us. And it still is of overwhelming importance for us. This is the first time in modern world history that African people from around the world get together and say, we're going to figure out a way to work together to fight against the problems that affect all of us. 1900 in London, the first Pan-African conference. Next slide. This gives birth to the idea of Pan-Africanism, another key term everybody should know, Pan-Africanism. According to the African Union, it's an ideology and movement that encouraged the solidarity of Africans worldwide. It is based on the belief that unity is vital to economic, social, and political progress and aims to unify and uplift people of African descent. Now, there's another definition for Pan-Africanism that we'll get into later in the course, but this one is the general idea that most people know when they think of Pan-Africanism. This is where it begins. Next slide. This is Henry Sylvester Williams, the Trinidadian who had this initial idea in mind. He has a Canadian connection. He goes from Trinidad up to Canada, studies at the University in Halifax, gets his law degree. He's actually one of the founders of the Colored Hockey League in Nova Scotia as well. That's how important this man was. He ends up going to London and then, again, connecting with Benito Sylvain and others. Next slide, please. Other people connected with this conference. The great Booker T. Washington, who we talked about, as well as W.E.B. Du Bois, the first black man to get a PhD from Harvard, black intellectual, writes a great deal, is one of the fathers of modern day sociology. He's there as well. He actually attends the conference. Booker T. Washington tells everybody about this conference. He publicizes it everywhere he goes in the African world, writes it in a number of newspapers. Every black person that's able, come to this conference in London. Du Bois is also there. Du Bois goes to the conference. Washington does not. Du Bois actually does. Next slide. So the conference representatives came from the United States, Antigua, Jamaica, Trinidad, St. Lucia, Cuba, African countries like Ethiopia, Gold Coast, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire. All these Africans representing these different nations met together in London. Next slide. From Africa. So it's funny. Benito Sylvain doesn't say he's from Haiti. He represents himself as being a representative of the Emperor of Ethiopia. Ethiopia, also called Abyssinia. You have FSR Johnson from Liberia. You had G.W. Dove from Sierra Leone. You get Ribeiro from Gold Coast, which is now Ghana. These are the Africans that attended. Next slide. Benito Sylvain would write in his book, The African Star. He had a newspaper called The African Star. He would write about the conference. He would write about what was going on in the African world. Next slide. And that's where his write-up from the conference is. He kept correspondences with W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African intellectual. Next slide. And I'm going kind of fast just for the sake of time. Next one more. From Europe. So these are the Africans that were living in Europe that came for the conference. You had representatives from black folks in Scotland, England, different places. The Fifth Jubilee Singers were represented. The Afro-West Indian Literary Society. So you had all of these folks coming from different areas. Next slide. From the Caribbean, you have, again, folks from St. Kitts, St. Lucia. You had lawyers from Trinidad, from Dominica, Jamaica, Antigua, so many different places. Next slide. From the U.S. and Canada, you had Reverend Walters, who actually becomes the president of the Pan-African Association. He's an AME church leader from the States. You have Miss Anna Julia Cooper, one of the great thinkers of the African world. This is a woman that writes in a book, A Voice from the South, and she talks about the triple oppression that African women face. Racial oppression for being black, gender oppression for being women, and also class oppression for being workers. Very important text. So again, this wasn't just men at this meeting. You had sisters as well. Mrs. Anna Jones from Missouri, Mrs. Berrien from Washington, D.C. I can't stress to you enough how important this meeting is. This is 1900 London. These people are getting here. They're not flying in airplanes. They're getting there on steamships. These people are getting there and hearing about this through telegrams and writing letters. To get all of these African people from all around the world in one place, in London in 1900, to talk about the issues that affect all of them is incredibly significant. It should not be minimized. This is one of the most important meetings in African world history. Next slide. And one more, this is that. I don't know why I duplicated this. Next slide. From this meeting where they would meet, they would discuss the colonial problems. They would discuss lynching in the United States, the practice of taking African men, women, and children and murdering them, and then, often mutilating their bodies and doing this. This was happening in the United States. They would compare that to what was going on in Congo, what was going on in Namibia, what was going on in other places, in Kenya. They created an association called the Pan-African Association. They attempted to create more congresses, but eventually, because of things that would happen around the world, the Pan-African Association actually collapses, but it's picking up by other Africans later on. And Williams ends up going to South Africa after the conference and continues to organize. So I need you to picture this in your mind. You have a brother from Trinidad, born and raised in Trinidad in the Caribbean, who studies in Canada and organizes in Canada. Then he goes to London and organizes. Then he goes to South Africa and practices law and represents black folks in emerging apartheid South Africa. It's not apartheid yet, but it's coming. And he's organizing for African people. It doesn't matter where you go in the world, is what I'm trying to say. This is coming from Ottawa. I'm not originally from Ottawa. I'm originally from the States. I lived in West Africa for a little bit. Wherever you go, you organize. You fight for African people. And this is what Henry Sylvester Williams tells us. Next slide. Next slide, please. So, again, his travels. Trinidad, all the way up to North America. He goes to New York for a while. Then he goes to Canada. Then he's in London. Then he goes back to the Caribbean and organizes for a little bit. And then he's in South Africa as well. So you see this movement that's occurring. African people don't sit still, and they're organized. The next slide. When he goes to South Africa, he's right at the time, at the end of the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa, where the white folks fought each other, and now they're ready to work closer together to continue to exploit African people in South Africa. Next slide. And the Africans resisted as well, going back to that original idea of that Ethiopian prophecy. So you had Africans in South Africa like Shepard Struman, also known as Hendrik Beker, who took the fight to the whites in South Africa because he was convinced about the Ethiopian philosophy. And he said he was convicted of killing a number of white farmers in South Africa. And when they finally captured him, he said, yeah, I admit that I'm guilty. I, Henry Beker, laid hands on those two souls. I have a craving in my heart which must be made known to everyone. I admit that I'm a worker of God. I confess to the court and all the white people that I'm placed here by the Lord and that I do his will. The time when the whites had the upper hand is past. This is for Africa alone, but God has taken power from the white man throughout the world. This is what he believed as he was fighting in South Africa against white folks. And he felt, and they, eventually executed him after he said this. But this is the type of mentality, the type of fight that was occurring among African people fighting against colonialism. Next slide. This is the same type of fight that we see in the Bambata Rebellion in 1906, where parts of the Zulu nation rebelled against the South Africans. All this to say, during this time period that this book was written, that Benito Silva put pen to paper to talk about what was going on in colonization, this Haitian reflecting on the colonial world, you had Africans all over the world fighting against this system. Whether they were on the continent, whether they were in the Caribbean, whether they were in North America, all eyes were on Africa. And African people were ready to fight against colonization, both at home and abroad. So we're going to stop there today because that's kind of just where I wanted to start the class, to let you know what was going on in the 1890s, in the early 20th century, and how Africans responded to it. So if you get a chance, if you can speak French, or if you have the time to do what I did, which is take the French text, put it in Google Translate, and read it in English, read that book, the historical study on the fate of the natives and colonies of exploitation by Benito Silva. Read that book, look at his arguments, look at what he says. So we'll stop there today. We will not have class next week. Again, I'm going to a graduation, but if you can, read this book. It is on our free course website. I hope you register for it. Or you can find this book on Amazon.com or Amazon.ca or any other booksellers. I say Amazon because it's convenient, but we also have to struggle against Amazon too because they exploit black workers. And there's a whole thing about that. We'll probably talk about that toward the end of our class. But if you can, get this book from somewhere. You can find a black bookseller. Get it from a black bookseller. But it's also available online for free. But we're going to examine Batu Allah by Rene Maran in 2 weeks' time. So you have 2 weeks to read this short book. It's only less than 200 pages, and it's really big font. So read this book. We'll talk about it when we meet up again on May, what would that be, in 14 days? What's that, May 20th? May 20th. So we'll see everyone then. Take the time next week that you would be in class, looking through our course website, looking at our materials. You can watch previous lectures. With that being said, we'll stop for today. We'll open it up to question and answer or discussion or community announcements or anything of the sort. Anybody have the hands up? Any questions? I see a hand. Mr. Francis, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to ask you, Dr. Ledbetter, in 1900, when all of these Pan-Africanists were meeting in London for that first conference, they could only have gotten there by means of sailing ships. And I'm just wondering, what sort of a treatment these black people endured on this trip to England? Is there any recording of how they were treated? I would imagine segregation took place just as much on the ship as anywhere else.
Yes. I mean, these ships, that definitely occurred. Now, they all didn't travel at the same time. Some of them were actually even in London or in other parts of Europe at the time.